This video is going to be about bass management in terms of picking the right frequency. Hi, my name is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about bass management and how it works in home theaters and why you pick the frequencies that you would pick to align the subs and the main speakers best you can. The issue is actually significantly more complicated than we often make it out to be, and yet the solutions for the average person are significantly simpler than we sometimes make it out to be, because there is not a distinct right answer that you can come to analytically or even by listening that you're going to find to be best. So let's just start with why we bass manage speakers. So let's look at this. This is the F100 from Martin Logan. It's a new speaker. I'm reviewing it. This is a tower speaker. It's got 3 bass drivers in it, right? I mean, this thing should have plenty of bass. And actually, it does have a lot of bass, and we have 2 of them. So why would we bass manage these? Well, there's a couple reasons why we might. So the first may actually have nothing to do with the speaker. It may be an amplification issue or even a thermal power issue. It is very likely that this speaker actually can't hit reference levels, run full range in this room. So if we were to do that, we would run into a problem where this speaker, even if I had infinite power, may actually kill itself, or if nothing else, distort horribly before it actually hits that. So that is one possible reason why we would do that. And that's for a big tower like this. For smaller speakers, instead of saying it might, it's probably a definite. So that's one issue. The next issue is most people doing home theaters are doing so with a receiver. These receivers have a fairly limited amount of power. Trying to produce reference levels or even 10 dB below reference levels of output, full range, would be more than that amplifier could handle across the front 3 channels, or even the left and the right channel. So you'd have a pretty high chance of clipping the amplifier in your receiver. Bass managing tends to help with that. And in fact, the higher the frequency that you bass manage at, the less power is needed to produce those bass frequencies, the more headroom you get in the receiver. So that's a good reason to do it. But then you have the primary reason why home theaters were designed around these bass management concepts. And that's that this is not actually a very good place to produce bass. This area in the room, we're about 1.5 meters from the wall or so, or it's definitely at least 1 meter. It's 1 meter to the back of the speaker, so it's at least a little bit more than that. So I'd say 1 meter to 1.5 meters. It's out from the walls. It's about 1 meter from the wall on either side. All of that is going to lead to SBIR effects. And this happens to not be a place where we're going to get a lot of room gain for bass either. Pushing it up against the wall would increase that. Well, there's a simple solution to that. Put the subwoofer there, where it's supposed to be, and leave the mains where they are best for best imaging and performance. And then bass manage them so they're not trying to produce the bass and let it go to the subwoofers. So that was the main idea behind bass managing surround systems, was you could basically offload all of that bass that these speakers aren't very good at reproducing. You can put these speakers where they're best for best sound and performance without worrying about the effect on bass, and then just have everything go to a subwoofer, a bass dedicated speaker that would handle that. It allows smaller surround speakers. Again, they can be placed where they are best for surround sound. It allowed potentially smaller left, center, and right speakers, but even if they are large, to just not have to worry about the bass that they're producing. And then we could have one big amp for the subwoofer and smaller amps for the rest. It was all better. And the THX standard that we landed on, that just has become an industry-wide standard, was to do so at 80 hertz. So I have people constantly asking me, well, is 80 hertz really the right frequency, or should it actually be higher or lower than that? And the answer is, it depends. So what I would say is 80 hertz is actually probably the right frequency for most people. You could try a little lower, you could try a little higher. If the speakers are not dynamically capable of producing the bass that you need them to produce, there are actually speakers that cannot do reference levels at 100 hertz, or at least not at 80 hertz, and so you're better off using a higher cut point. So in those speakers, yeah, 100 hertz might be better. The problem you'll run into is at a certain point, the subwoofer is actually going to cause problems for you. You're going to be able to hear the bass coming from the subwoofer, so you're going to want to lower the crossover to prevent that. But I've heard people say they had to lower it all the way down to 60 hertz before they could not tell where the bass is coming from anymore. To me, if that's true, there's something wrong with the subwoofer. Or there's something wrong with the location of the subwoofer, because a subwoofer should not be able to be detected so readily that you needed to lower it all the way down to 60 hertz before you couldn't tell. So in my opinion, I don't know that you'd want to be bass managing that low. I actually think 80 hertz is a pretty good number regardless of how bass capable these are. Now there is something to be said for having lots of low frequency sources in a room. It's actually my preferred way to handle bass. It deals with modes. So I don't really like to have one subwoofer. I don't even really like to have two subwoofers. I prefer to have 3 or 4 or 5 or more. And one of the ways to do that is actually to utilize every low frequency source you have. So as I mentioned, these actually are very bass capable speakers. This is probably a pretty good full range speaker. Would I run this thing all the way down to 20 hertz? Maybe not. But what I could do, for example, is I could give these a good 300 watts each. So they've got plenty of power, for the sake of argument. I could run these down to 35 hertz, where they probably have plenty of headroom for normal, moderate to small sized home theaters. And I could use them as 2 low frequency sources. Then, in this room, for instance, I could add another, let's say, 2 or 3 subwoofers. Maybe I have a subwoofer in the corner over there. I actually have 2 in the back already. If I did the 3 subwoofers I just mentioned, I actually now have 5 low frequency sources. And from 35 hertz up to, for the sake of argument, the crossover point we'd be choosing for the subwoofers of, let's just say, 80 hertz, I've got those 5 sources overlapping each other. And if everything is integrated properly, which can be tricky, but if you get everything done correctly, then what happens is you get the benefit of all those sources, exciting modes. The modes are fixed in the room, but they're excited by the location of the source. So now we have lots of different locations of low frequency sources to excite those modes, and we get a more even distribution. Then the EQing becomes a much easier process. We also have the benefits that any sort of audibility to the directionality of bass in that kind of critical, we'll say 60 hertz to 150 hertz range, is maintained in those left and right speakers. So there's some real benefit potentially to leaving these full range if you can get away with it. Now the problem that you're often going to run into is that this is a ported speaker. The group delay rises at actually well above the port frequency and then continues to rise as you get down to that port frequency. The port itself is in opposite phase to the woofers at the particular frequency of the port tuning. So if I try to integrate this with subwoofers, which are not doing that, then what happens is you get an area where all of a sudden there's cancellation. Often what I see is actually at the lowest frequencies you get cancellation. And getting it all to work together can be a real pain in the butt. Yes, there's all-pass filters you could play with. That might fix it. Yes, you could do some other tricks. I gotta tell you, 9 out of 10 times, I stuff the ports. And the thing is, that's part of what gives the speaker its good bass performance. It has a lot of cone area, which helps, but it's those ports that are really substantially helping the low end. So once you've plugged those ports up, you actually lose that benefit. There's no excursion control anymore, and you don't get the output benefit of the port. So if you can make it work without plugging the ports, that's certainly a better way to go. But sometimes the response is just uglier. And again, the whole point of this was to make a better response. And you get better results if you actually fully bass manage these. And so that can put you in a situation where you could avoid bass managing those, and you could have these overlap with the subs, and then you'd end up having to, as I said, stuff the ports. Now in terms of how to do that, there's some, it's like a double bass type approach. There's some processors and receivers typically have a mode that allows you to do that. That's how you would do that approach. A lot of people think it's a terrible mode and they get terrible results. As I said, that's actually more from the fact that they're setting it up wrong than a problem with the mode. The mode works as it's supposed to. If you're getting a bad response, it's just not set up right. So back to the point of this video, bass management, it's in a lot of speakers handing off the bass capabilities to other low frequency sources like optimized subwoofers is a better approach. If your speakers have really good bass capabilities and good dynamic range in that bass area, yeah, they could probably serve as a bass speaker as well. And there is some benefits if you know how to set it up, but it is complicated, it's harder to do, and I would recommend against it unless you really do know what you're doing. So hopefully that's helpful. Now in terms of the magic frequency part of it, I'm just going to quickly cover that. There is no magic frequency. There is no reason why 70 hertz is going to sound better than 80 hertz is going to sound better than 90 hertz, other than being able to detect its location. It's not real likely that you're going to detect the location of a subwoofer at 80 hertz, so doing lower, in my opinion, is not necessarily a great idea. In the event that that's true, I would really look carefully at the subwoofer and listen to it on its own to figure out what's going on. And in fact, if you have measurement capabilities, take measurements, because it's very possible that there's something wrong with the subwoofer. There have been a couple of commercial offerings, but they're not as common, but lots of DIY offerings where the port tuning was done so poorly, basically, that the port is the problem. So what can happen sometimes with these DIY efforts, and like I said, commercial offerings don't do this for a number of reasons, including often the engineers know better, but the other big one is they just don't tend to tune so low. But if you tune the port too low, and you make the port sufficiently large, then what happens is you develop a port resonance that's actually in the audible range. It's in that 80 to 125 hertz range. And once that resonance gets excited, it makes like a honking sound, and it's relatively easy to detect. So if you've got a subwoofer with a honking port, you're going to hear that. And that honking port is going to allow you to detect the location of the subwoofer much more readily than the subwoofer should have been otherwise. So as I said, if you put it at 80 hertz and you listen and you're like, I can totally tell where that subwoofer is, and you turn it down to 60 hertz and it goes away, like I said, I would take a look and see and make sure there's nothing wrong with the subwoofer, because it should work fine at 80 hertz. At the end of the day, that may be okay too, though. There is nothing wrong really with setting the speakers at 60 hertz. The issue is that the difference actually between 80 and 60 hertz can be quite substantial in the amount of loss of headroom that you would have with the amplifier. And the subwoofer still is going to generally be a more capable low frequency producer, even in that 60 to 80 hertz range, than these speakers are. So if you can get that subwoofer crossover point up to around 80 hertz, it really tends to be better. Again, that's my coverage of that, and we're going to talk actually about, in another video coming up, bass management in the home environment, in the residential environment, versus in the commercial environment, like the screening rooms that are used by professionals for editing and watching movies. They actually are not the same, and I think it's really interesting. So thanks for listening, and I hope that you come back to watch the next one.